things, and they want you to be adult and get a job, that other kind of stuff. But I had, my first couple of years of college, I had a bunch of different majors I considered. One point I was going to be a history major. Another point I was going to do, I briefly toyed with music for a little bit until I really played with some guys that could really play. I was in the honors college, and I even considered at one point being a philosophy major. Because, you know, I like to think a lot and ask deep questions. But the thing about philosophy majors is I also like to eat. So finding a job being a philosophy major is a little tricky. So I didn't go that route. But now, that doesn't mean that there aren't occasions in my life where I become very reflective. And I tend to think a lot about all kinds of things. It's what, you know, allows me the ability to get up here and talk to you people every Sunday with something new, because there's always something playing around in my head. And there are times where I reflect even on my own life about identity, about purpose. Case in point, last week I had a birthday, and I turned 39. So it's kind of the end, you know, I'm kind of reflecting on the end of 30s. I feel like I'm almost, when I hit 40, I might actually consider myself an adult most days. I do some a little bit, but there's still times where I'll still look for the real adults in the room. So I might get there. So like I said, I naturally bend towards the philosophical. Birthdays seem to make me always a little more reflective than other times. And I don't mean that, and for me, I don't reflect on my biological age and get depressed about my inability to process carbs like I used to, or that my hairline seems to march steadily upward. Both observations that I've made, but I'm just dealing with that part of life. And I'll joke about those things. But the reality is, I don't really fear. Aging isn't something that bothers me. It doesn't really, you know, I don't think about how little time I've got left or that kind of thing. Rather, what I use my time around my birthday, I like to reflect on this question: who am I? Probably more accurately, who am I becoming? Because let's face it, that's where we all are. We never arrive at the place of the person we want to be. But we're always kind of reaching for this goal of a person that we want to become. When I examine my life from my earliest memories up until now, despite all the failures and setbacks, do I like the person that is emerging right now? Am I still in the process of growing more like Jesus, the one I purport to follow, or someone else? And because I'm part of the human community, what do the people around me say? And what do they think about me? Do they see me the same way that I see myself? Now, here's a caveat. Maybe I'm weird. Okay, we know I'm weird. And I tend to overthink things too much. But I would like to think that probably at one time or another, we've all walked by a mirror and stared intently into the reflection's eyes and asked the question, who are you? And now, while you may have never audibly asked those questions, I mean, I've audibly asked that. When people ask, are you talking to yourself? Yes. But probably, at least you may have reflected on those in your head. And I think these are questions that every human being asks. Since the beginning of time, every human being on the planet has pondered this question. Now, one of the beautiful things I find in the New Testament is that even Jesus himself often wrestled with his role in the unfolding narrative of the human story. One of the most evident of these stories is found during his time leading up to the crucifixion, when he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. But there were other times as well when Jesus looks incredibly human, and he asks questions of his disciples about who they think he is. Mark chapter 8, verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, who do people say I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets. But he looked at them and said, what about you? Who do you say I am? Peter answered, you are the Messiah. Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So Jesus begins with this question to his disciples. Who do the people, the crowd, who do they say that I am? What do the crowds that have gathered think of me? Who do they think that I am? Now, at this point, there's all kinds of rumors floating around about this simple rabbi from Galilee. But no one is really sure about his identity. Some think he is John the Baptist, returned from the dead. Remember in Bible study last Wednesday when we were covering the death of John the Baptist, that's what Herod the Tetrarch, the ruler, thought. That, oh, John has come back to haunt me for the things that I've done to him. And it was his greatest fear. And some thought that he was Elijah, and that was one of the greatest prophets from Israel's history who had returned from heaven. Or maybe some other prophet from Israel's past. Of course, I think Peter is being nice here because he doesn't state what the teachers of the law think about Jesus. You know, we've covered that in the Gospels. They always accuse Jesus of being some sort of incarnation of Satan or a demon. So, you know, perhaps Peter's being a little too nice. He is too concerned with the masses. They see him maybe... I think one of the interesting things is about these crowds is they don't see Jesus as the Messiah. See, perhaps Jesus appears too nice. He's too concerned with the welfare of the masses. And to them, the Messiah was supposed to look more like a warrior, like King David from the Old Testament. Kings fight wars. Messiahs fight wars. That is just the way it's supposed to be. So there wasn't much thought from the crowds that this Jesus was the Messiah. So then Jesus deepens the question a little bit, and he asks it another way. Looking at the disciples, he says, "Who do you say that I am?" Now this is a question, I think, and we can see it on the page here, but I think it's a question that each of us have to answer for ourselves. This is a question that I think Jesus asked of all of us. And it is probably the most important question for us as people of faith. Because how we answer it, both with our verbal confession and how we choose to live our lives, affects how we answer the question, who am I? So in other words, how I answer the question about Jesus affects the person that I am becoming. So maybe it would help. Give me a little latitude here. Y'all give me a lot of latitude. To bring the dialogue maybe forward to the 21st century. So let's take out, John, the crowd's answers about him being John the Baptist. They don't really apply to, we don't get a lot out of that. But let's kind of bring this dialogue forward, and let's start it again. Jesus looks at his disciples and say, "Who do people say that I am?" Now some say, an uneducated first century Jewish peasant. Some say a great moral teacher like Confucius. Some say you didn't exist at all and you're just a myth like King Arthur. And some say you just came to earth to die on the cross for our sins, and all that stuff you told us about how to live our lives and change right now, it really doesn't mean anything. And that's a lot of answers that you get out of society these days about who Jesus is. But then Jesus, again, turns to us and say, okay, that's what everybody else is saying, but who do you say that I am? It makes the question a little more relevant, doesn't it? What are you going to do with this Jesus? It's a very personal question that each of us, and Jesus invites each of us to, in every successive generation, to wrestle with this question. Now, for good old Peter, the answer was obvious. And he just blurts it out. That's why I love Peter. He talks before he thinks a lot. I have suffered from that sometimes too. He said, "You're the Messiah, the one who comes in the name of God, the one who will reconcile all things to God. That is who you are." Now notice Jesus' response, though. It's quite interesting. He doesn't say, he says, "Don't tell anybody about it." Wait a minute, hold up. If this is the truth, if Jesus is the Messiah, the one who's going to bring everything back together and bring people to God, shouldn't the disciples be organizing mission trips? Shouldn't they be preaching this in all the synagogues? Shouldn't they get bullhorns and stand on the street corners and talk about how Jesus is the Messiah, the one who comes and who's going to, reconcile our relationship to God? Why on earth would Jesus command that this world-changing message be kept quiet? Now, I don't purport to understand the mind of Jesus all the time, or really that much. But I think it was because Peter knew the word. He knew the word Messiah, but it didn't mean what Peter thought it meant. Just because something can change the world doesn't mean that it needs a public announcement on Facebook. Verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." This is how Jesus answers the question, "Who am I?" I find it interesting that to elaborate on Peter's confession, you notice that Jesus switches back from the word Messiah to his preferred title, the Son of Man. It's almost as if this term Messiah, at this point in history, it has too much baggage attached to it that Jesus wants to undo. Especially in light of what he says next, that he will be rejected and suffer and die. And here's the thing about Messiahs. Messiahs don't do that. Messiahs come with swords blazing, with righteous judgment and angel armies. They smite the heathens so that the oppressed can then go and see, I told you my God was going to take care of everything. And then if they do die, then it's a noble, sacrificial, honorable death in the heat of battle for the cause that they are fighting for. They don't get executed like common criminals. So this teaching, it disturbs Peter to his core. When he confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, this was most certainly not the image that Peter had in mind. So he pulls Jesus to the side and begins to rebuke him and say, "Now wait a minute, Jesus. It's not supposed to go down like this. This is not how it's supposed to happen." But Jesus isn't having any of Peter's arguments. While Peter had the correct word for Jesus as the Messiah, Jesus is explaining to Peter what the word actually means. Jesus is answering that question, "Who am I?" I am the one who comes in the name of the Lord. I am the one that declares his kingdom has already come, and that this kingdom looks nothing like anything this earth has ever seen. It is a kingdom that doesn't come through violent conquest or fear, but through sacrifice. It isn't announced from the pulpit of the temple, but through the work of being present to people who need it. A kingdom built from the bottom up. Peter's concern was a very human concern, self-preservation in the face of persecution. For Jesus, though, the concerns of God were foremost on his mind, the restoration and the reconciliation of all things. So then Jesus, he again gathers the crowd, and he further elaborates on how those who follow him should see themselves. Verse 34. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory and with holy angels." So Jesus has answered this question of who am I? In this part, Jesus turns the question back on his audience. Who are you? Are you one who chooses to follow me? Because if you do, then a simple confession isn't going to just get you there. Disciples of Jesus must also wrestle with themselves. Jesus uses this term, deny ourselves. And I'll be the first to admit that this isn't a concept that I like or that I think is easy. And for the longest time when I read this passage, I conjured up the image of this internal struggle. Facing temptation down and saying no to it. In a more humorous thing for me, it's looking at that pan of brownies with peanut butter M&Ms in it and saying, "No, I will only have one." Of course, like any other temptation, I'll pass that pan 3 times and I'll probably eat half of it anyway. My resolve isn't that great, and I'll eat half the pan. Am I denying myself? It has its feelings of a struggle. I'm a list maker. We make a list of all of the stuff that we're supposed to do or not do, and we avoid it and we check things off. We check things off of it. Now, if you're also like me, what you end up doing is if you fail on the list, then you walk around carrying a ton of guilt on the way that you fail to live up to that standard you set for yourself. But through the reading this week and really wrestling with it, I came across another way to look at it. Denying ourselves isn't about avoiding a list of sins. It is about surrendering ourselves. The image of the cross, of crucifixion, is a very graphic but a very powerful image that Jesus uses here. Rather than overcoming myself through sheer grit and determination and force of will, the way is more about surrender through resignation. I deny myself not through a force of will, but through the act of giving up. If you work hard at trying to save your life, you end up losing it. But if you surrender to me and what I am doing, you will find it. For that is really the most important question of the quest of this existence. A funny observation about this section is that through various translations, the term that's used for life and the term that's used for soul here on these two verses, they're actually the same word. The different translations kind of, they interchange life and soul in different ways. So what I thought was interesting is when I went back to read it, I put a hyphen in there for the word. For whoever who wants to save their soul life will lose it. But whoever loses their soul life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul life? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul life? So it just pulls it out of that kind of abstract concept of just soul and life and say, well, it's everything. It's the whole package. It's who we are. And if you're trying to wrestle with trying to save it on your own, and trust me, I am the best at trying to do that, about making that list, about trying to live up to some sort of artificial bar that I set for myself. And I do really good at it for a while until I crash up against the ceiling and then I collapse and I have to realize, oh, wait a minute. I'm trying to save myself. I can't do this. Now, I'll tell you, I've been doing this now, I'm now 39, and this is still something that I wrestle with a lot. So I come back and I visit these things and I realize it's not my job to save myself. It's not my job to try to live up to some sort of artificial standard that I can never meet. But it's my job. It's my job to give in to the way of Jesus and say, I'm going to follow you the best I can. So Jesus invites each and every one of us to ask, who do you say that I am? And how does that answer the question, who am I? As we stand and pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I love you so much, and I thank you for this day and this chance to gather here, God, and my prayer is that you would be among us, God, as we kind of read through these passages of Scripture about wrestling with who we are, who you are, and how that affects who we are becoming, the people we're trying to be. And God, my prayer is that if people are trying to make these lists and set all these artificial standards about how they can try to reach you through efforts, God, that you would do for them as you do for me, and remind me that it's not that this is not something that I can do on my own, and that by denying myself, it isn't about making a list and following something on a page, God, but it's about following you, and it's about surrendering myself to you and giving up and giving in, God, and letting you have your way in my life. We thank you so much for that grace and mercy that you've given us. Amen. Stay standing.